Hi, my name is Tanya Glessner. I live in Fort Scott, Kansas, in the United States. I am a Christian author and mentor, and I'm going to share my testimony with you today. I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas. I lived with my mom and my dad, and I had two younger brothers. So my dad, he struggled with addiction a lot, and life was pretty chaotic. My mom knew how to push his buttons. There was a lot of drugs, a lot of violence in my home. And I remember one day I went to stay with my grandma when I was about 11 years old. And I had no idea that my parents were considering a divorce. And my grandma was pretty bitter about the divorce. And I remember running around the house and I was so excited. And somehow we got to talking about how my brothers looked like my dad. And I said, oh, well, I look more like my dad. I loved my dad. And she had been drinking and she looked at me and she says, well, he's not your dad. And I just said, well, what do you mean? At 11, you don't really think about these things. And so I said, yes, he is. I look just like him. And she looked at me and she just said, no, he's not your dad. Your mom needs to tell you the truth about who your dad is. And I just remember being like devastated. It felt like it just hit me with a ton of bricks. And then she told me that my parents were getting a divorce. My grandpa was over there trying to get her to stop. I could tell it hurt his whole heart. So he took her and he walked her to bed. I called my parents and I remember they showed up the next morning and they were sitting at the table and they were both in tears. I could tell that was not how they wanted things to go. But it was true. So the man that I thought was my dad for 11 years was in fact not my dad. Um, so of course I had a bunch of questions. And at this point, I just felt like, I didn't belong. I didn't know if I was really loved. I had a whole bunch of things running through my head. And I was sad that they were divorcing. So um, I asked to meet my biological dad just to see what he was like. So my mom took me to meet him. We met at a mall. And I learned that I had two half sisters that were both younger also. And so I got to meet them. Um, I only saw my biological dad about a handful of times throughout the rest of my life. He never did make the first effort to reach out to me. I had to make all the phone calls. And if I wanted to see him, I had to go, do the drive. And it was a couple hours away to go and visit him. He actually ended up dying in 2008 of cancer. And we had a couple phone calls before then, but he didn't want anybody really to be around him when he was dying. He did let my sisters come around him, but he told me that the guilt was too much. He couldn't bear to have me come and see him at the hospital before he passed away. So our last words were not the best. So that hurt, and it still kind of hurts to this day. Anyways, after my parents got a divorce, I stayed with my mother and my two brothers, and she started dating again. And we moved in with one of her boyfriends, and he was in the military, so he was home most of the time, but sometimes he would get shipped off and come back. He drank a lot too, and he was extremely violent. Um, I remember one time him and my mom had gotten into an argument downstairs, and I was upstairs with my two brothers. I was probably about 12. And so I think that my middle brother would have been about 6, and my younger brother, I remember him still being in diapers, so he was probably about 2. Um, I heard my mom's boyfriend start shooting his gun in the house. He had lots of guns, but I know it was a rifle that he kept downstairs. And so you could hear the bullets flying around the house. And my 12-year-old brain, the only thing that I could think of was to grab my brothers and hide in the closet. So I got my brothers and I put my middle brother on my lap, and then I stacked my baby brother on his lap because all I could think of was, well, if the bullet comes through the floor of this closet, maybe it'll hit me first. But there were so many stories that were like that. And I just remember asking myself, why my mom would stick around for that. But my mom had a lot of things happen in her childhood and her growing up. Now that I'm adult, I can kind of look back, not making an excuse, but I can see how, somebody that is struggling with their own mental things, they just don't know the right things to do. You don't know until you know. Um, Anyways, there were many other stories like that. I mean, I watched him beat my mom bloody many times. It was just really hard. So I got tired of the violence. He started beating me up and choking me and slamming me into the refrigerator and things like that. So I went to school just angry. I remember just being so angry and tired of being hurt and, nobody doing anything. There's the adults that I have told, the police have come, but nobody did anything. He never did get locked away for a long time. And I still to this day don't understand all of that. But I decided one day when I went to school that, maybe if I became the monster, it would stop happening to me. So I started beating girls up at school. And I remember the first time the school called my mom and her boyfriend to come pick me up. They were so proud of me for beating this girl up. They took me out for ice cream, and I was like, oh, well, I'm going to get rewarded now. And maybe, I'm not going to get beat up anymore. So I did. And I finally got expelled from school for beating girls up. And I had to finish that year of school on a mental health ward of a hospital. And that summer, I remember I got out and I just started running away. I would run and stay with my friends until their parents were like, hey, you need to go home. And I started acting out. I just couldn't take it anymore. So I remember my mom shipped me to live with my grandma here in Fort Scott, Kansas. And I started my freshman year of school and it went pretty good. I made friends and I loved my grandma. She just a good woman. Um, but I had a falling out with one of my teachers and I got kicked out of school again in the middle of the school year. So my grandma sent me to a Christian school here in town because we don't have many schools. It is a small town. And I remember just how different the kids were. And I remember how different the teachers were. And I just remember feeling welcomed, but uneasy because I hadn't experienced anything like that before. So I finished the school year out there and I did get to learn, more about who Jesus was and, what it was like, to be a part of a Christian community. I liked it, but my mom, she took me back home that summer. And we got along like rabid dogs. We just fought and fought and fought. Um, so my sophomore year, lived in Lewisburg and went to high school there. And on my 16th birthday, I went to school and I had them call my mom and tell her that I was dropping out of school. I signed myself out, went home, and I packed my bags and I moved in with a girlfriend of mine in Fort Scott, Kansas. So here I am, 16 years old now, and I'm on my own and I'm really honestly just a mess. I'm a kid who's been through all kinds of craziness, and I think that I can do it on my own. And I did. I did get into drinking a little bit with my friends, but I did have a job. I ended up getting my own apartment here in Fort Scott, so I paid my own way. I didn't have a vehicle. I walked everywhere I had to go. And then I finally did get a vehicle and I got a place of my own, also a house in a place called Arma, Kansas. So I had two jobs, was traveling back and forth. I had a house and an apartment. I'm 16 years old. I'm doing these things. I did get my GED. Um, I started taking a couple college classes later on. But then I got kind of tired of doing that and I moved back to Kansas City for a while and just kind of did some, teenage things. And I wound up pregnant. I had my first son at the age of 18. I was a month away from being 19 years old when I had him. And I just remember being scared. I was so scared and so excited. I wanted to be a better mom to him, but I was still young, and you know, you don't have all healthy life experiences to know how to, to be the mom that you want to be when you're at that age yet. So I ended up meeting my first husband when I was 19, and he was wild, and I just fell in love with him, straight away. But I did not know that he had a drug addiction. I knew he was doing some strange things, but in my mind, I didn't think a 19-year-old was somebody who was going to have any kind of an addiction problem. So we ended up moving down here to Fort Scott to try to, make our lives better. We just thought it would be a small town and we could, have a better life here. Um, we were together on and off for about 15 years. I had another son with him, my first husband. Um, and after fighting with him all the time and his drug addiction, my family was like, when you're married, you're supposed to make things work. You're supposed to stand by your husband and you're supposed to be there for him. So I did all the things that I thought a wife was supposed to do, but there was so much chaos and violence, and he would be with me and he would not be with me. We were never stable. We would move. One time we moved 13 times in 1 year. I just remember never having a stable home, and the kids never could get comfortable living anywhere. So finally I did file for a divorce after I couldn't take it anymore. And he didn't want the divorce. He did, ask me to not do that. I remember my grandma sitting with me and on the bench outside of the courtroom, and he was sitting across from me just begging me not to go into that courtroom and do it. And it was so hard because I did love him. And we did have a lot of history together. So it was hard. Um, anyways, I did follow through with the divorce, and I did get custody of the kids because he got up on the stand. They UA'd both of us, and I was clean. I didn't do drugs then. And he failed for every single thing and just got up on the stand and admitted that he had been up all night using drugs the whole night before. So I ended up getting custody. I owned my own salon. Things actually went pretty well. It hurt. I was hurting and I was suffering. Um, and I would go to work, and on the weekends, sometimes I would go to the bar with my girlfriends. It happened, a couple times a month. And then that turned into every week. Um, and then I remember one day a friend of mine and I were driving home from the bar, and we were giving a guy friend of hers a ride home, and we dropped him off, and I went to take her home, and I looked at my back seat and I was like, what is this big bag of white stuff in my back seat? Well, he had a huge Ziploc bag of meth in his pocket that had fallen out because it was wintertime and it was cold. I didn't know what meth was. I think I had heard about it, but I didn't have any idea what it looked like or what it did or how he used it. Um, and she was like, "Oh my goodness, she's like, this is meth." And so we went straight back to his house, and I'm like, "Get this out of my car." I was repulsed and just absolutely disgusted that this was in my car and that this was happening. And then he ended up giving her some. And then I remember she was like, "Well, hey, why don't you just try it so you can see, it's not that bad." So I remember I was like, okay, I'm going to give this a try. Well, I smoked it and I was like, oh, well, this is all right. I have energy. We can do things. And I was hooked. I like immediately, I remember I was hooked. Everything just spiraled from there. So I went from having a business and doing well and having my own home to losing my business. I shut it down, but that was more through the divorce anyways. I couldn't afford to keep the building on my own and my home on my own. It was just too much. So I did lose my business. And then now I have this home, and I'm like, how am I going to pay my bills? I have this drug addiction. I have these kids. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm not getting child support. Oh, he was supposed to pay, but he never really did. And he never did show up hardly and take the kids either. That was always a battle. So I remember I called a friend up in Kansas City and I was like, hey, I need to make some money and I need a connection. I need somebody that I can get large amounts of meth from so that I can make some money and, you know, feed my addiction and pay my bills. And it happened really, really quickly. I remember people that were in the meth world here in Fort Scott, they were just like, we don't even know where you came from. You were just like this, decent human being. And then all of a sudden now you're this big drug dealer. And I made thousands and thousands of dollars a day. It was crazy, but I would spend it just as fast. And my house became the flop house for every, addict in Fort Scott, Kansas. But my family, like they became my dysfunctional, comfortable family. We weren't very good to each other, but we were comfortable with each other in a really unhealthy way. Um, I remember going from smoking, and most of the people around me were IV drug users. They were on the needle. And I remember being appalled at that for the first couple years and just told them, hey, I don't want to see it. I don't want it in my house. And then I started getting depressed. And I remember telling myself as my addiction went along, there is no God. I just remember thinking if God was real, things wouldn't be where they're at. My marriage wouldn't have fallen apart. I wouldn't be this horrible mother. Now I'm a drug addict and I'm trying to take care of my kids. And I just feel like, a horrible, horrible person. So my mental health just plummeted. And then one day I had a couple friends over and I looked at them and I said, I want to try it on the needle. I said, I want you to shoot me up because I don't know what I'm doing. And they were like, no, we're not going to be the first ones to do that to you. I said, well, here's the thing. I said, if you don't do it and you know what you're doing, I said, I'm going to try to do it. And I may end up killing myself. But I said, I'm done. I want to do it that way. So they ended up putting it together and they injected me. And I remember the high that it gave me. There was nothing that I had ever experienced like it. And from that moment on, I was done. It was just an absolute wrap. I was completely hooked. Um, I remember my boyfriend and we would have a lot of arguments. There was a lot of crazy things that happened in my house because of everybody in their addiction, whether it was them doing stuff or me doing stuff. And then I ended up in the hospital with pneumonia. So I think I was in the hospital about a week and I came home and my boyfriend, I had found out he cheated on me. So I messaged him and told him, I'm done with you. I don't want to see you again. And he sent me a message and said he was coming over. And I said, well, don't bother. I'm not going to let you in. And so I just assumed that was over with. So I called a girlfriend of mine. I said, hey, I just got out of the hospital. I'm really weak, but I would like to get high. So she came over and she brought me some drugs. We shot up, and right about this time, just a few minutes later, my back door gets kicked in, and we both look and we see, and it's my boyfriend. And I just told her, I said, hey, you should just go ahead and go. I don't want you to have to deal with my stuff. So I get up and I'm so weak now from being in the hospital. I'm so weak from the drugs. I braced myself like this on the doorway, the frame of the doorway, because I just didn't have the strength to argue with him. But he wasn't having it. He wasn't leaving. He wanted to argue. He wanted to have that moment. Now, he had never, ever been physically violent to me. So I never would have thought that he had it in him. We had arguments, but usually it was just a big verbal blow up and it would be over with, and then we'd get back together later on. I told him to leave, and I remember him turning around. He had a cigarette in his mouth, kind of hanging off of his lip. But I remember him turning around, and I thought he was leaving because the door's still open from him kicking it. There's a huge footprint on the door. The frame is busted open now. And all of a sudden, he just turned around and just lunged at me with all of his entire might. And I remember the look on his face. And so I fell back, and out of instinct, I put my arms down to catch myself. Well, I remember I felt this pain and I went to get up and then I looked down and I was like, oh no, my hands had both my wrists had both broken in half and my hands were resting. My hands were up here on top of my wrist, like that, on both my hands. So they had just completely snapped in half. And I remember my body going into shock. I remember just shaking and just could not believe that this was happening and it was real. And I remember now I'm looking up at my boyfriend who is pretty pleased with himself. And then all of a sudden, I see the look of fear come over his face because he's like, oh no, I'm going to be in trouble. So I looked at him, I said, I can't get up off the floor. I'm like, you have to help me up. You have to get me to the hospital. And he sat there for a while. He got on his phone and was playing on his phone for a minute. And you could tell he was happy and he was scared. And finally, and I looked at him and I begged him. I was like, please, if you will just get me up off this floor and you will get me to the hospital. I said, I won't tell. I said, I promise you, I won't tell on you. I said, you can hold my purse. It's my phone, my driver's license. It has my family jewelry in my purse. I kept it with me because I didn't want any of my addict friends to steal it. I said, I promise you can keep my purse with you in the car when you take me in. I said, I'll tell them it was winter. I said I would tell them that I slipped on the back stairs because the stairs were slippery. It was the only thing that I could think of to get him to consider helping me. And so he finally agreed and picked me up off the floor and got me to the car and drove me to the emergency room. So I go into the emergency room and he stays by my side. He does not leave me the whole time. Well, they asked for my insurance. They wanted the insurance. Um, and the insurance was in my purse in the car. And they were adamant that he needed to go get it. And he didn't want to look even weirder because you could see that they were already questioning the situation. The staff was. You could see looks in their faces. So he was trying to be, to oblige so that he didn't look guilty. Um, And so he did go get my insurance card. And I didn't tell them then because I was scared. He had a gun in his car, he had a gun in the trunk. And I just thought, what am I going to do if he goes to get that gun and he comes in here and he shoots me, or he shoots the nurses, or he shoots the doctors? And I just remember keeping my mouth shut until he brought the insurance card back in. And as soon as he came and dropped the insurance card back in, he said he was going to go smoke a cigarette and he never came back. I remember sitting there waiting for him to come back and still scared and still not telling them, hey, my boyfriend did this to me. And finally, as the doctor was in there and he was trying to reset my arms and doing all these things, I told them the truth. And they all looked at me and said, we knew it. We knew that that's what happened to you. Um, Anyways, so the police came to my grandma's to take the official report once I was home. And I remember the first officer walked in and he looked at me in front of my grandma and he goes, well, what did you do to deserve this? And I was like, what did I do to deserve this? I was like, I might be a drug addict and stuff, but I said, I didn't deserve this. There's nothing and no one that deserves this. And he's like, oh, well, let me rephrase that. He's like, what did you do to cause him to do that? And I was just like, okay. So I told him the story. Anyways, but that hurt my feelings. And I just remember, oh, because I'm an addict now, I deserved this. It never sat well with me. And my grandma was I could tell it hurt her. Um, Anyways, I remember I was in my cast. They put me in casts up to my shoulders, and I was in casts for months. And my sweet grandma, she had to take care of me. She had to feed me. She had to bathe me because the way the casts were, it was like this. So I could only go like this. My cast wouldn't bend to where I could get my fingers to my mouth. And she did everything. She had to take me every time in the middle of the night that I had to go to the bathroom. I had to have her come help me. Um, it was it was hard, and I could see, that she was disappointed, and seeing her disappointment, and having to have her help me like that it hurt my soul and it was degrading. Um, but my addict mentality was not over yet. I finally got put into some short casts that were up to my elbows, and I remember, oh, I can reach my vein now. I can go get high and I don't have to deal with this anymore. I can feed myself and dress myself now, even in my half casts. And I did. I did go and with casts on, still got high and missed him. I remember the guy that broke my wrist that I'm terrified of. Now I miss him. And so I ended up getting a hold of him, and he was like, "Oh, I missed you too." He told me all the things that I wanted to hear. He's like, "I missed you too, but I was scared to reach out to you." They still hadn't arrested him or done anything yet. So we got back together. I got my casts off and full on dealing drugs and being dumb again. He never did do anything physically to me again, but our relationship was an addict relationship. We were violent. We weren't faithful to each other. We were just doing all the wrong things. And I became extremely depressed and extremely suicidal. And I remember one day I ended up over at a stranger's house. It was some girl's house. And I went into one of the bedrooms and I put the needle in my arm with the drugs in it and I injected it into my vein. And I remember the needle falling to the carpet in a way that it landed with the needle in the carpet standing straight up like a dart. And I collapsed to my knees. And I remember staring over this needle and I was just like, God, if you're real, save me because I cannot save myself. Um, Not very long after, I ended up at a house to deliver drugs. And when I walked in the door, there was a girl there that I had some serious issues with. Um, and I remember her and I had a verbal confrontation. It turned physical. She ended up needing to be hospitalized from the physical altercation that we had. It was 8 days before the police found me. And I remember the night of the physical altercation was the last night that I used drugs because I knew when I left there from how badly I had hurt her that I was going to go to jail. I knew that it was coming. Anyways, I I knew in that moment that God was going to take this horrible thing that I did and turn it to something good. If there was a God, he was going to do it then. I just wanted to be, dead at this point, but I wasn't dead. God didn't allow that to happen to me. So 8 days later, after that incident, I was arrested. I went to jail and I started to, detox from the drugs, which the first 3 days I remember was really rough. And I remember in my mind, I thought, oh, I'm going to sit here for a little bit. I'm going to get out on probation. I'm not going to be here very long. Well, that is not what happened at all. So I sat there for a few months in county jail and I started going to these Bible studies. There was a church that came in there to minister to all of us. And I ended up getting a Bible from one of them. And I remember just things started open up to me and the guilt that just started to weigh in on me was unbearable. I just couldn't even stand to feel anything at this point because I was like, wow, what have I done? I ended up signing my kids over to my grandmother before I got arrested because I knew I was going to end up in jail or dead. It was not going to happen any other way. Um, so I sat there and I prayed, to God and went to these classes and I decided I wanted to be saved. And so the church ladies sat with me and told me the prayer to say, and I gave my heart to Jesus in county jail after I'd been there several months. That day I went back to my cell and I remember I had one of those orange jumpsuits on and I went and I adjusted it and I clung to my Bible and I slid down the cinder block wall and I just looked up and I was like, God, search my heart. I am so sorry. I cannot believe that I did what I did to this girl. I just felt terrible. I thought I am being a monster. I don't want people to hurt me, but I'm hurting people. Um, and I sat there with God for a while and I cried and I went to bed and I got woke up the next morning and I got pulled out into the hallway. I had told God the night before that I wanted to make amends with her and at least apologize before I went to prison. But I was like, oh, there's no way that can happen. Well, I underestimated God. That is exactly what happened. Um, The officer pulled me out into the hallway and was like, Tanya, you've been here, several months now. We've noticed your good behavior. We don't feel it's fair to farm you out of this jail, so your family would have to drive so far to see you and stuff. They said, but we have arrested your victim and she is now in this jail. But, I had accepted my plea. So legally they could put us in the same, you know, jail cell if they wanted to. It's really uncommon. They don't do that ever. But here's God making it happen. He's doing the thing that I asked. Um, she was like, so are you comfortable with, being housed with her? We can't farm her out because her behavior is too bad. The other jails won't take her. But, you're welcome to stay or you're welcome to go. You just decide. And I thought, wow, I'm in jail and I get to have some power over what is happening to me. I get to choose where I'm going to be at. And here's God, telling me this is your chance. If you want to make amends, you ask for it, you got it. But you're going to have to do it in front of all of your peers, everybody that is in this jail cell with you. Um, and they were all my friends, from the streets, and they had, a friendly loyalty to me, an addict loyalty to me over this girl. So I looked at, the officer and I said, you know what? I said, it's fine. I said, it'll be fine. I said, bring her in. And it was around dinner time, whatever meal we were having. I think it was dinner time. Um, so I remember us getting ready to get our trays, and she walks in, and you can tell she is just terrified. The look on her face, I remember she just thought, oh man, this is going to suck. So she went into her cell and she climbed up on her top bunk and she just sat there. So we get our trays and we're sitting down, and I can tell, oh, she's not even going to eat. So I walked over to her door. I could tell everybody behind me was like, oh, here it is. It's going down now. Like they were just waiting for this big confrontation to happen. Um, and I just looked at her and I said, I'm not going to hurt you. I said, let's go get you a tray. And I said, there's a seat next to me at the table. I was like, you can come and sit by me. And you could tell she was hesitant, but at the same time, I'm sure she was hungry. I'm sure she was tired. And she just thought, well, no matter whether I go or I stay, it's going to be whatever it is. So we get our tray, we sit down, and I made it known that I didn't want anybody to, bother her. We're eating. I start trying to talk to her a little bit. And I know I'm looking around and the people at the table with me are just looking to be like at me like, are you serious? Or is this a setup? Are you getting ready to do something now? And so the girl to my left, she makes a little sideways comment. And I looked at her and I was like, here's the deal. I was like, if you're going to come at her, you're going to have to come at me first. And I remember that girl who was my friend, she just kind of looked at me like, what is happening? Who are you? Who are you? Because you are not, the Tanya that I know from the streets. Um, Anyways, so from that moment on, her and I made amends. And I remember, I think it was the next day, her and I got together and sat down. We sat down with our Bibles even. And I gave her like my official apology. We explained a few things to each other. She apologized to me too, for the things that had led up to the situation. And everybody was nice to her after that. And nobody questioned me. I know that I got a weird look now and then, even from the officers, because my reputation in this town was just violent, and drug addicted and just out of control. So for people to see me being kind, forgiving, understanding, and helpful was out of my character. But the uncomfortableness for people was, they were starting to see Jesus in me, and I didn't even realize it yet then. But God had already started to work on cleansing my heart and my life, and it was pretty unbelievable. He can make the impossible things happen. So I moved on. I went to prison, and I remember the ride to prison. I prayed to God all the way there because I knew I was going into the unknown. You see prison on TV and you're like, oh, it's going to be this certain way. There's going to be all this craziness that happens. And, I got my prison sentence, actually, let me back up a little bit. When I went to court, I was facing 21 years. So when they offered me a plea of 8 years, I took it. I ended up doing 7 years with my good time. I did get all of my good time. So I show up in prison. I prayed to God and I said, you got this 7 years out of me now to sit down and make this happen with you. I was like, I don't want this to be all in vain. So I was like, do your thing, show me that you are real and show me what you can do, because I said, I can't. I said, clearly, I can't. Um, so I go to prison. I remember the first year was just kind of getting acclimated. It was very uncomfortable. There is everything you see on TV does happen in prison. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of sexual immorality. There are officers sleeping with the inmates. There's, staff bringing drugs in. There's all kinds of things that happen in there, but they don't really show all the good that happens in there too. I experienced a lot of love in prison from some of my fellow inmates that you wouldn't expect. We became each other's family. We had to look out for each other because the prison wasn't, the staff wasn't, looking out for us. We were just kind of like a herd of animals in there together. It was not good, but prison isn't supposed to be good either. But there's things that happen in there that should not be. So the first year, like I said, I was getting acclimated. The second year hit me. I was really depressed again. I missed my family. Now my kids are, being raised by my grandma. And I'm missing out on all their big events. I have a granddaughter at that time. I had a granddaughter that was 11 months old from my oldest son when I was arrested. So now I'm missing out on her first birthday and, all of those events. So my second year did end up challenging me quite a bit. And then I finally decided I'm going to get involved in programs. I'm going to start doing things. I'm going to go to church. I'm just going to make sure, I get outside and exercise. I've got to get my mind right because I can't do 5 more years like this. It's just not going to happen. So I did. I started doing all those things. I started going to the programs in church and all these things. And I started helping women get their GED. So I, started sitting down with these ladies and tutoring them. I remember I started doing the ladies' taxes because some people did have outside jobs, but they either had to file their own taxes or have somebody outside do it. But most women in prison didn't have somebody outside do it, and they didn't know how to do that kind of stuff themselves. But I was blessed that I did. So I did that. I'm also a hairdresser, so I would cut people's hair. We'd go in the bathroom and I'd give them a new look. And people got to know me as a godly person in prison, the staff and the inmates, and they would seek me out to pray with them and fellowship with them. And that felt really good. And me and a few other of the Christian ladies in the prison got together and we started prayer groups on the dorm. And so we have 1,000 ladies at our prison. That was kind of the capacity there. So now we have every dorm that would meet, at a certain time of day, and we would hold each other's hands and we would pray. So that was kind of a new thing, and the group and the circle kept getting bigger and bigger, and it was wonderful to watch, and people looked forward to that. And then finally, I made it to where I was about 5 years into my prison sentence. I qualified for an industry job, which I got to work outside of the fence, but it was still just with inmates. And it was at a cabinet factory. And we had male supervisors there. And there was one male supervisor that I somehow I caught his attention. And I don't know how, because I didn't really wear makeup. I didn't, do my hair like that. You just look kind of crazy most of the times. But somehow I got his attention and he decided he liked me, and he was married. And some of the other girls liked him because he would bring them, bring them, watches, food, whatever the thing were that they had asked for. So I was always really uncomfortable around him. I always tried to make sure that I wasn't alone around him, because he did get in my space pretty often and he would say vulgar things. But I knew if I went to tell, what happens in a prison with women is if you go and you tell about something like that, and there's other women that like that man, they get mad at you because now you have messed up the things that are coming into them. And, and the staff, well, prove it. I have to prove it. Who's going to listen to me and believe me? I've watched it happen to a bunch of women, and not very often did something come of it. So I didn't want to tell, but I did go back and My roommate that worked with me, she knew. I did talk to her, and we would pray about it every night and go back to work. And I just remember like feeling physically sick some days going to work because I didn't want this man to be around me, but I didn't want to cause a scene because I didn't want the retaliation that was going to come from it. And then one day, him and one of the other bosses had bought donuts and some treats and stuff, and they had laid them on the break room table, which was at the complete opposite end of the building. But I got stuck cleaning the glue machine. So I was alone. You can't leave the glue machine until it is completely clean. Otherwise, the rollers would dry together and it would be thousands of dollars to replace. So I got stuck alone cleaning this glue machine, and all these girls are running to get all their donuts and their treats and stuff. And I was like, oh no, here he comes. Here he comes. And so I'm trying to hurry up, and I'm getting this last little bit rinsed off, and I'm trying to get it shut down, and he's here, and now he's trying to drag me outside, out back of the building, um, to have his way with me. And I just remember thinking, I could fight, but I'm a violent offender. I'm in prison already this long. What do I do? I don't want to do this. And Lord God, thank you. I remember in my head, I was like, God, help. You know, my roommate had forgotten something, and she opened the door and came back and started walking our way. And I took off running towards her. She saw what was going on. Um, and I just took off, and I went back to my dorm and I told on him. And it did turn into everything that I thought it was going to be. He did end up losing his job. All the women were questioned. It turned into a big investigation. People did admit that they saw him giving me, that kind of attention, but they didn't want to say anything about it either. But really, everybody was pretty understanding, except for there was one person that was very angry that she lost her person that was bringing in her stuff and her things. So that finally passed. And my last year of prison, I ended up making it into work release, which I got to go outside of the prison and work in the community at this point, which there's only 28 women out of 1,000 women that get to have this job, this privilege at this prison. So I was really proud of myself. I had come a long way. I was also on the board of a Christian women's group there, and that was fun. And I got to go to outside retreats and things like that. I got to go help feed the homeless, while I was in prison. So God protected me. I was never harmed in prison, and I could have been many times. There was a lot of horrible things that happened, but God got me through it and got me through it blessed. Um, so about my last 6 months of prison, I ended up getting an email from my high school sweetheart. He had been checking in with my mom over the years just to see how I was doing. And then my last 6 months, he reached out and he was like, hey, you know what? I miss you. And he was like, you know, why don't you and I, why don't we just make this work? When you get out, let's just do this. Let's be together. And we did. So we talked and made arrangements that, upon my release, I would release to him, and that we would get married. He's a paramedic. And he's a captain paramedic, and he's been in the medical field ever since I can remember, since he was about 18, I believe. Anyways, so getting ready to get released, I remember calling my mom and talking to my two brothers. We were so excited for the Christmas that I was going to be released, because it would have been the first time that me and my two brothers and my mother would be together in over 20 years on a Christmas. It would have been a really exciting moment. We were all looking forward to it very much. I had one brother, my youngest brother was in prison at this time too. So it would have been the Christmas of, we should have all been together, because my younger brother wouldn't have gotten out until 2020. My middle brother he was out in the world. He'd never been to prison. They both struggled with drugs on and off also. But right before I got out, I remember praying to God, I'm scared, I'm nervous, I'm getting ready to marry this man. I know him, but this is a big step from being in prison for 7 years to jumping into, being a wife and a stepmother because he had two teenage children. So I get out. I remember being nervous. I come here and we get married, and life is good. I'm talking to my family and I'm trying to get acclimated. I applied for a job at so many places. I can't even count. So many doors closed on me because I was a felon. No one wanted to really give me a chance. So my husband was like, why don't you just open a salon? We have a room in a house. We'll do that. And so I did. I opened a little salon in the house, and we made that work. His two teenage kids live with us. And I started healing my relationship with my brother, that was free. His name is Canaan. And, it was really nice getting to talk to him. He looked like he was getting cleaned up. He was a millwright worker. He was traveling the world, working on things and getting paid to go and travel the world and see it. And we were so happy for him. And he looked so good. December of 2020, he did come over to my house for Christmas, so I did get to see him then. My other brother was still incarcerated then. But like I said, we were still looking forward to the next year. I'm trying to think. And his 38th birthday would have been in May. May 13th was his 38th birthday. He was away in Colorado on a job. But like I said, we really didn't see the signs that he was still using. They had just finished a job, and I had sent him a text saying, "Happy birthday, brother. We're planning your birthday party. We know you're going to be home in a few days." We were so excited. We had all the cake stuff picked out and, all the things. And it wasn't unlike him to stay a couple days. He had been to Portugal, all kinds of places. Once the job was done, for him to, run around and do the scenic things and to live life a little. So we hadn't heard from him in a couple of days, and we just thought, oh, it's normal. Well, after 4 days passed, we were finally like, something's wrong. Something's wrong. His phone's going to voicemail. We've called the hotel. They told us, they can't really tell us anything. And they looked at his last checkout time and realized it had been 4 days since his bedroom door had opened at his hotel. Well, then we called back and they're like, well, we can't discuss anything with you. Now, at this point, my mom has just lost her mind and she can't handle the phone calls anymore. So I take over all the phone calls. I'm calling the police, the hospitals, the jails. I'm calling everywhere, and nobody is telling us anything. And I finally get a hold of somebody at the police department, and they're like, well, somebody will be reaching out to you. I'm not the right person to tell you. I said, can you just tell me my brother is alive? What is going on? And it's hours now. Hours have passed. And so I finally called the hotel person back, and I was just like, please. I was like, I know you can't tell me what has happened to my brother, but I said, can you give me a number? I was like, for the love of God, my mom is over here losing her mind. We just need to know, is he dead? Is he alive? I said, my mother wants to know if her son is dead. And we can't try to go to sleep like this. And she said, well, you know what? She said, hold on. God love this woman, whoever she is. God bless you to this day. If you ever see this, thank you. She says, I do have this number over here. She goes, maybe you could try it. And she wouldn't tell me who the number was. So I take this number and I call. And the voice on the other end answered, the county coroner's office. So I knew he was dead. I said, is my brother, Frederick Cannon Lee Smith there? Is his body still there with you? I did have the wherewithal to just know to have that be my question. I didn't want them to know that I didn't already know. And he said, yes, it's here. And I said, well, can you tell me what he died from? And he said, we're waiting on the lab results to come back. But he said they did find fentanyl in the room with him. And we think that that is what he died from, and that is what ended up killing him. They found him dead on the hotel floor, and then we found out later that he his head was kind of in the trash can, like he bent over to change the trash can out, and must have passed out then and died like that. So it was really hard because you always ask yourself what you could have done more. But the truth is, if an addict wants to use, they're going to use, and there's literally nothing you can do until they make up their mind to change their ways. Um, so it hurt because my brother had a big heart. He was a hard worker and he did have a drug addiction, but that's not all he was. That is not all who he was. He was my brother. Um, and I love him. I have many happy memories with him, and I thank God for those every day. So now instead of planning his birthday, we got to plan a funeral. My mom, of course, was just a mess. I had to call and tell my dad that my brother was dead, and I will never get his the screaming out of my head, listening to him on the other end of that phone. And I went into business mode at this point. I didn't allow myself to grieve because now I had to call the funeral home. I had to go pick out a headstone. I had to comfort all these other people around me now because everybody wants to come to me and tell me how sorry they are with their tears in their eyes and their grief. And so I'm trying to comfort them and get this funeral planned and do these things. And I remember being at his funeral and just looking around trying to console everybody else, and it nothing really hit me yet. Um, it took several weeks, and then it hit me all at once. I was angry. I was so angry, and I couldn't get out of bed anymore. And so I did seek my Christian fellowship, the people that I had been talking to from my church, and I did go get counseling. And I did the things to try to pull myself out of it because I knew that I couldn't sit here and deal with this grief on my own. Um, and I did give everything in my heart to God because it was just way too heavy for me. And even now it still is. It hurts. It will always hurt. But I have learned that I have to give it to God and just thank Him for those happy memories that I got. Um, anyways, I decided once I kindly got through the initial grief that I wasn't going to let this be for nothing. That I didn't want other families to go through this, this thing. And so I decided to do a mental health fundraiser through my salon. I did a whole bunch of haircuts, and all the money that people gave me for the haircuts, I put towards this mental health fundraiser. And they put that on TV. If people go to a doctor when they're physically sick for help, there is nothing wrong with reaching out for help when you're going through your emotional struggles. You have to reach out for help because sometimes your mind gets stuck in this cycle and it is almost impossible for you to pull out of it by yourself. So I am a huge advocate of reaching out for mental health services, whether it's Christian or whether it's at your local mental health center. Um, I I speak up about that a lot, and I do believe my brother struggled with some things himself. He went through a terrible divorce, and he was lonely, and I know he was trying to self-medicate. So I did that, and then I was like, you know what? I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to reach out to inmates, and I'm going to start mentoring them so that maybe I can help get them on the right path and keep them on the right path as much as I can on my end when they are released. And that turned into mentoring addicts in my community. And now I, I can't count how many people that I have mentored and mentoring now. And I've gotten addicts into treatment. And I feel like God is using me, to get through to others. But He has used me in a lot of big ways. And I do believe God has saved lives through me. I don't take any of the credit because God changed me. God brought me here. If I would have kept on my own path, I wouldn't be here right now either. I'd be out there next to my brother. And that's the truth. Um, So I'm still doing that to this day. And I kept having people come up to me and say, hey, you know what? You should write a book. And just different people didn't even know each other. I just kept getting that. And then um, finally, one day it just hit me. I was like, I felt God say, hey, you need to sit down and write this book. And so I looked at my husband. He was like, yeah. He's like, I've been telling you that. You need to do that too. He was another person that was like, you need to write this down. And so in 2023, I published my first book. It's called The Light You Bring. And it did a lot better than I expected it to, because I just sit down, I'm writing, I'm like, I'm not really anybody. My story is not really anything, more or less than other people, but God will do big things. If you just, cooperate and trust him, he will do things. And he has through that book, even to this day. And I felt God telling me, well, don't stop there. And I think it's Revelations 12:11 that God says you defeat the enemy. He's talking about the devil by the blood of the lamb and by the word of your testimony. Um, and I thought, wow, and to not love your life unto death. And I just thought, boy, that's all I have to do. I was like, bet, God, I will tell them all about you. I will tell them everything that you have done, because I can't count all the times that God has saved me where I could have been dead. And I've always had food in my stomach. And even when I was homeless, I still had some type of shelter. God has saved me. I've been wounded, but I haven't been beat. And that's God. So then after sharing, my testimony a bit in my first book, I thought, I'm not going to stop there. I want to share other people's testimonies. And so I wrote another book called Stand Up 8, sharing other people's testimonies. And there's a variety of them in there. And I love listening to other people's testimonies. I love the healing and the connection that comes through that. Um, and now I'm working on my third book. I'm writing a daily devotional for 365 days a year. But that's not the only cool thing that happened. I had the Salvation Army reach out to me here in town, and they said, I've been looking for somebody to be the president of our board of directors. She's like, I know you don't know me, but she goes, God told me to reach out and ask you. And I was just like, wow, somebody just told me that God reached out through them to reach out to me and ask me to come take this position. And I just thought, Lord, here I come. And so now I'm the president of the board of directors in the Fort Scott Compassion Ministries here in Fort Scott. And I get to help work with, the people in the community that need it. I get to go and give my time and, my energy into help making the world around me better. And I'm being blessed, and I'm being a blessing in the process. And I don't think that I could ask God for anything more. I've just learned that, through salvation, you have to use one of your hands to cling to God. As he's pulling you out, he's constantly pulling us closer to him. But we have to use our other hand to grab a hold of somebody else and bring them with us. That's why we have two hands. It's just God will get you through something. He will take what is low to bring down the things that are high. Where he's going to put us all on the same level playing ground. But that's my testimony.
Amen. Thanks, Tanya, for sharing that. It's really amazing and it's really inspirational. I think I just have one or two questions that I want to ask you. You talk about the time when you started getting into drug addiction. How old were you when that happened?
I was about 33
Okay.
when I got into the addiction, and by 36, I was in prison.
Okay. And then the other thing that I want to ask is people that's busy watching this video right now, people that are stuck in drug addiction, what advice do you have that you want to give to them?
I would say don't waste another day. Spending today in your addiction is only going to guarantee that tomorrow is going to be harder if you are lucky enough to have tomorrow. Um, Reach out and ask for help. There are resources, but you're going to have to do the work. You're going to have to do, the hard things. But like I said, if you don't do them now, you may never get to do them at all.
Yeah, that's good advice. And then maybe do you maybe want to pray for people watching this that's stuck in drug addiction? I want to ask you
Yes,
to pray for them.
yes. Lord, I come to you now and I ask you to be with those who are struggling with addiction. And I also ask that you be with their families. You are our great deliverer. I ask that you remove all outside influences that are not of you. I ask that you get everything out of our hearts, minds, body, spirits, and souls that are not of you. And I ask for you to remove the taste for addiction and replace it with a hunger for you. May these chains be broken, Lord God, and captives set free. Help them and their loved ones to heal and forgive through your grace and to bring you glory, dear God, and honor, and give them the courage to speak up and to share their testimonies and to help others make it home to you, dear God. Thank you for your endless love and for sending your beloved Son, Jesus Christ, in whom we have salvation. In Jesus Christ's name, I pray. Amen.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think maybe my final question, and this is the question that I love asking everybody, is who is Jesus to you?
Oh, Jesus is my everything. He's my Savior, my God, my absolute all in all.
Amen.